Well, here we go, U.S. history. If you've watched our video launch, you know that this lesson is a 2 week lesson, It'll be due May 29th. And again, the lesson is going to can be comprised of 3 videos that I'm going to create that deals with this very long war, the Vietnam War. And so I kind of broke it down into thirds, into 3 videos. Real quick reminder, during this video, I will point out 3 questions that you'll need to answer. You're more than welcome to kind of write out the notes, pen in hand, as I kind of go through the presentation. That might maybe help you answer the 3 questions that I'm going to point out, but I kind of let you do what you need to do in answering these 3 questions. So when you answer these 3 questions, they go into your brand new living document that deals with the Vietnam War, and obviously add some pictures or maps. And again, I'll kind of let you decide how many pictures or maps that you put with each answer. That will obviously kind of help tell the story. So here we go. This is video number 1 of the U.S. involvement in Vietnam. And so, what I'm hoping to accomplish in this first video, is to explain, how the United States got involved in Vietnam, why we got involved in Vietnam, and also how the war was able to escalate, how it was able to get bigger, where it basically lasted, 18 to 20 years, and where we ended up having, close to like 500, 600,000 troops, as you can see over here, boots on the ground deployed. So kind of hoping to answer in this first video how the United States, or why the United States got involved, and basically how it escalated our military presence in Vietnam. Probably, again, I think I mentioned this earlier when you guys went to Washington, D.C. as 8th graders, you probably saw the Vietnam Wall. And again, what kind of jumps out at me is there's really nothing fancy about it, but it might be one of the most moving statues or moving tributes in Washington, D.C. How long it is, how high it is, the number of names and how small the names are, and how those small names kind of fill up the wall. But, the Vietnam War, basically middle 60s, um, you know, um, to when it ended, probably divided this nation, more than any other issue since the Civil War. And we've had some really divided issues, and we still do today. But Vietnam, obviously really divided our nation, more than any other issue since the Civil War. At the end of the day, around 58,000 troops were killed in the war. That doesn't really talk about the ones that are still missing in action, that were probably killed and just never discovered or never found. The number doesn't really probably show the number of soldiers who died after the war, who came home and probably dealt with the horrors of the war and maybe committed suicide, or just their physical and mental health, going downhill because of the war. So 58,000 is the estimate. The number is probably much higher, but that's kind of what the history books say of U.S. soldiers that were killed. The history of Vietnam, obviously, I think before we get into the war, we got to have a little bit of a backdrop. Again, this kind of deals with Western imperialism, how the West once, kind of colonized the globe, rivalries and resources. In this area of Vietnam, kind of known as French Indochina, was once a colony of France. And so when I say French Indochina, it was basically Vietnam, maybe Laos and Cambodia, those countries of Southeast Asia. And so they were once colonized by France. So again, there you can kind of see the map of Southeast Asia. And what happens is during World War II, Southeast Asia is taken over by the Japanese. We know through World War II that the Japanese kind of becomes an aggressor in World War II, and goes out and conquering land. And so during the 30s and the 40s, the Japanese, as it was expanding its colonial empire, occupied this area of land known as French Indochina. After World War II, France tried to reclaim this territory, tried to reclaim its lost land. Not going to get into this very much, but make a long story short, as the French came in trying to recolonize this area, they were met with resistance. They were met with fighting and war, and make a long story short, which Mr. Flynn can do, doesn't always do, France loses. And so this area of land will no longer be under control of the French or the Japanese. And then the French, of course, try again, and they lose. Okay. What happens is it's kind of a playbook um, of what happens in Korea. At the end of World War II, Korea is divided into North Korea and South Korea. And with North Korea being communist, South Korea being more democracy, this is kind of like the same compromise that's being done in Vietnam. Obviously China, as you can see, excuse me, bordering the North, wants it to be communist. Of course, the United States kind of want like democracy. And so it's kind of like the same compromise that we'll take the country of Vietnam, we're going to divide it in half. The dividing line became known as the 17th parallel. So the North was going to be communist and the South was going to be democracy. So that was kind of the plan, what we were going to do with Vietnam at the end of World War II, when the French were no longer going to be able to colonize it. It became known as the Geneva Accords of the 50s, where we basically say, hey, let's try to appease everyone. Well, not really everyone, but let's take Vietnam and let's split it at the 17th parallel. The North would be communist, with the capital being Hanoi, and the South would be democracy, with the capital being at that point known as Saigon. So that kind of became the game plan of how to split up Vietnam at the end of World War II. In the 60s, obviously, we have President Kennedy. And again, we talked about Kennedy last week. And I guess this is the beginning of the United States starting to expand its role in Vietnam. Obviously, communism was our Cold War enemy. And so what we do, we, the United States, is that we are going to support the South Vietnamese. We were going to support democracy. And so kind of what we do, oops, I got to back this up. There we go, is that under Kennedy's leadership, and again, he's trying to look tough against the Soviet Union. Again, he kind of came in as the young, inexperienced president. He wants to look tough against communism. And so obviously the United States, we supply military equipment to South Vietnam. We provide money in aid packages. And what we do is we send, this is the beginning of the escalation, is we send about 9,000 military advisors to South Vietnam. And really what these advisors were, they were teachers, and not teachers, like Mr. Flynn or Mr. Hinga or Mrs. Pinkham, but these were going to be military teachers who were going to teach the South Vietnamese how to fight, how to defend themselves, how to use this equipment, because as we're sending South Vietnam this military equipment, this is kind of like high tech stuff. It'd be like, me right now getting behind the wheel of an airplane. I would have no idea how to fly it. I would have no idea how to take off. I would have no idea how to land it. I would have no idea how to do anything other than pray and say, what do I need to do? So I would need to be trained in how to use that. And so these advisors, we're going to kind of teach the South Vietnamese military, the government, kind of how to defend itself if it's ever attacked from the North. Kennedy, at this point, is resisting boots on the ground. So you could probably argue that maybe these military advisors were boots on the ground, but we weren't sending boots on the ground yet in a sense of doing any fighting. Okay? Well, that's the plan of Kennedy. And it's important to know that because as president, he kind of gets to set policy. We also know from last week that President Kennedy is assassinated in Dallas, Texas in November of '63. And so what happens is, when the president is, when the president resigns or dies in office or leaves office, is that the vice president takes over. And of course, we know from last week that the person taking over was a guy by the name of Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ. And so with Johnson becoming president, now here's something important to know as we get ready for our first question, is Johnson's going to have a different philosophy than Kennedy. So even though they're on the same team, they're both Democrats, even though Kennedy is the president and Johnson's the vice president, it's the job of the vice president to carry out the will of the president. So even if Johnson may not agree with what Kennedy is doing, his job is to be supportive. It's kind of like being that backup quarterback. As the backup quarterback, your job, whether you like it or not, is to support the starting quarterback, to give them tips and suggestions. And so if the starting quarterback comes out of the game and they have to punt, it's the job of the backup quarterback to say, hey, you should try this, or, here's the coverage that they're doing. But when Johnson becomes president, he's going to have a different philosophy on what to do in Vietnam. So this is the beginning of changing course when Kennedy is assassinated. And you get a brand new leader. And again, when you get a brand new leader, you get brand new ideas and brand new philosophies. Okay. So here's your first question that you need to answer in your living document, and it's in TCI 50.2 and 3. And so if you kind of can't figure out what I'm talking about here, you can always kind of look at TCI to try to figure it out. The first thing that you need to describe in your living document is you need to describe the Gulf of Tonkin incident. The Gulf of Tonkin incident. And this is the beginning of the United States escalation in Vietnam. So what we got right now is that we're supporting South Vietnam. We're supporting South Vietnam with money and technology and military equipment. And we've supported South Vietnam with military advisors to kind of teach them how to fight and how to defend themselves. Well, then you get this Gulf of Tonkin incident. And the Gulf of Tonkin, as you can see from this map, is just a body of water that kind of borders North Vietnam. So the 17th parallel is right about here. And obviously, South Vietnam is democracy, and obviously North Vietnam is up here in the Gulf of Tonkin. So that body of water is the Gulf of Tonkin. And what happens is we have some ships that are in this area, patrolling this area. And they're probably ships that are probably spying, in all honesty, surveillance, covert operations of maybe what's going on in this area. Because again, you've got North Vietnam here, communist, you've got China up here, so we're kind of have a naval presence in this Gulf of Tonkin. And what happens is, and this is the part that's kind of under debate, what happens is the story goes that our ships in the Gulf of Tonkin came under attack. And there's a good chance that these ships never came under attack. And in war, it is called the fog of war. And we all know with fog limits your visibility. Every once in a while at school, we might have a 2-hour delay because of fog, or you have to drive extra slow because of fog. And so fog limits your visibility. Well, this fog of war happens all the time, where things happen and you don't know what's happening. You start shooting randomly because you think you're under attack, and sometimes you might be shooting at your own side, the friendly fire. That happens sometimes. And so what happens is we claim that our ships in the area, our peaceful ships in the area, came under attack. And so what happens is that Gulf of Tonkin incident is like, hey, if our ships are being under attack, we, the United States, we deserve the right to defend ourselves. So the Gulf of Tonkin incident is, a body of water where we have some naval ships, again, probably covert operations, we claim came under attack. Looking back at it now, there's a good chance that didn't happen. It just sometimes happened in war. So you're going to need to explain the Gulf of Tonkin incident. The second question that you need to explain in your living document became known as the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. So you have the first question is the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Your second question is the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. And so what happens is in the United States, you guys know that we are based on checks and balances. The president can never declare war. The president can ask for a declaration of war, but that's got to be approved by Congress. So even after Pearl Harbor, the United States could not declare, President Roosevelt could not declare war. He had to go to Congress and say, hey, we came under attack by the Japanese, and you got Hitler in Germany and Mussolini. I asked Congress for a declaration of war, and Congress approves. So we're based on checks and balances. And so what happens is, following the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which may have never happened because of the fog of war, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution is President Johnson basically went to Congress. And he basically says, hey, I'm not asking for a declaration of war. I'm not declaring war. But what Johnson says to Congress is, I need to have more freedom and flexibility to send troops to the area of Vietnam quickly. I need to be able to act quickly if our interests become jeopardized or attacked. So today, if the president wanted to send, 50,000 troops, to a foreign country, he has got to get approval of Congress. Congress has got to approve it. And so, but the Gulf of Tonkin resolution basically gives Johnson a blank check that if he feels that he needs to send boots on the ground to protect Americans and American interest and interests of the West, he can do so without, here's the key thing to your answer, without the approval of Congress. Because again, checks and balances, the president's got to get approval, from Congress. And so Congress basically gave LBJ approval to send the military into Vietnam. I got a typo right here where it says SE, so I'll fix that. Let's see here. I can do that right now. We're able to send. There, I got that, just like that. It's fixed. To send the military into Vietnam. This is the beginning of expanding our role. This is how we were able to grow our military presence in Vietnam. The Gulf of Tonkin incident may not have happened, but we say that we came under attack, peaceful ships under attack. Then the Gulf of Tonkin resolution gave the president the authority to act quickly, to send planes, helicopters, boots on the ground to the area to protect interest. Your third question deals with this term called the domino theory. And this is why we get involved in Vietnam. We get involved in Vietnam is because we believe that communism was cancer. And, that cancer is an ugly word. I don't like saying that word because I think we've all been affected by that dreaded C word. But communism was a cancer. And we all know that the best way to defeat cancer is to nip it, is to catch it early. And I think we know that if cancer spreads, it becomes more deadly. It becomes harder to defeat. And so what happens is at the beginning of the Cold War, the world is kind of divided into red communist nations. It's kind of divided into blue democratic nations. So our belief is that we couldn't let the communist threat spread. And so it kind of became known as the domino theory. And so your third question is to explain the domino theory. And the domino theory was a belief that if one other nation fell to communism, then the next nation would fall, then the next nation would fall. So what you see right here in my picture is a domino called Vietnam. And so we all know that, dominoes, if you line them up right and you knock one over, they all don't fall at the same time. But if you line them up right, eventually they will all fall. And so that first domino was Vietnam. And so our belief was, well, if we let, South Vietnam fall to communism, then Laos will fall to communism, then Cambodia, then Thailand, then Burma, then India, then Bangladesh, and so the domino theory was the belief that if one country fell to communism, then the other countries would fall as well, eventually would fall. And so our philosophy was containment, that we needed to contain, we needed to stop the spread of communism. Okay. So as we get involved in Vietnam, basically we have two groups of people. We have people kind of known as hawks. These are people who kind of favored the war in Vietnam, who favored to stop the spread of communists. And then you had the doves, and these were the people who were against the war in Vietnam. Now, because of the Gulf of Tonkin incident that led to the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. So remember now, President Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, and his philosophy in 1963 was no boots on the ground. Now, he may have at some point as president, may have decided to send boots on the ground into Vietnam, but obviously he's assassinated. But by 1965, we start moving troops into Vietnam. Again, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution gave President Johnson the ability to send troops into Vietnam. And so our first troops kind of go into this area right along that 17th border known as Da Nang, D-A-N-A-N-A-N-G. And so by March of 65, 3,500 Marines are sent to Da Nang. By April of 65, we send 60,000 more troops. By July of 65, 125,000 more troops. So we're pushing about 200,000 troops now, boots on the ground in Vietnam. Why that was able to occur so rapidly and so quick is because of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, when Congress gave the president the ability to act quickly, act swiftly in sending troops on the ground. So the domino theory was the belief that we need to stop the spread of communism. And then the Gulf of Tonkin resolution gave the president the authority without really much stoppage. I mean, Congress couldn't really stop this because they've already kind of given him approval to do what you can do to save Americans and American interest. By 1966, 380,000 more troops. And then by 1967, about 500,000 more troops. So as you can see, the war escalates rapidly. And those are huge numbers. So we're pushing ballpark here, around 1 million, probably a little less, but around 1 million. But if you throw in the advisors and everything else there, you're probably at roughly 1 million. Okay. So this will conclude our first video. So again, in your first video here, you're explaining the Gulf of Tonkin incident. You are explaining the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. And then you're explaining the domino theory. And then obviously add in some pictures, maps, and graphs that go with that. All right. So that concludes our first video. And you have your first set of 3 questions that you'll need to. Video number 2 coming up, and I'll change ties. Obviously, I'm wearing the same shirt, but I'm changing ties.